Welcome back to the channel. I'm Sam, and tonight we're diving into the abyss of the unexplained. We're exploring three sinister houses, each with an insatiable hunger to trap its inhabitants. These aren't just haunted houses, they're prisons for desperate souls. So turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and prepare yourself. Imagine a town veiled in perpetual twilight where the sun never fully rises, casting long shadows over cobblestone streets. This is where our first story takes us, to a house at the edge of town, standing alone and forgotten, a silent sentinel to countless forgotten tragedies, its walls whispering secrets of the past. The Harpers, a young couple, bought the house seeking peace and a fresh start, unaware of the darkness that lurked within. They saw charm in its creaking floorboards, imagining the stories they could tell, and history in its faded wallpaper, each pattern a glimpse into a bygone era. They didn't see the warning signs, the subtle hints of a presence that had never left. It began subtly, as these things often do. A flicker of movement in the corner of their eyes, a whisper of a name carried by the wind through empty rooms. Sarah Harper felt it first, a sense of unease that she couldn't shake, a coldness that clung to her, seeping into her bones, and a presence that watched her every move, always just out of sight. John, her husband, dismissed it as nerves, attributing it to the stress of moving, but as days turned into weeks, the occurrences grew bolder, more insistent. Footsteps echoed in the dead of night, heavy and deliberate, stopping just outside their bedroom door. Then came the shadows, dark and foreboding, amorphous, ever-shifting. They clung to the edges of their vision, never fully revealing themselves. They danced in the candlelight, casting eerie shapes on the walls, twisted into grotesque parodies of human forms, mocking the living. Nightmares plagued them, each one a variation on the same theme. They were trapped, unable to escape the house's grip. One evening, as John sat by the fireplace, he felt a chill, an unnatural cold that made his skin crawl. He turned and saw her, a figure from another time, a woman, ethereal and pale, her eyes filled with sadness and longing. She stood there for a moment, then vanished. Terror seized John, paralyzing him. He tried to call out to Sarah, but his voice caught in his throat, fear choking his words. He ran to find his wife, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Sarah in the attic, whispering to someone unseen, her voice soft and urgent. "Sarah?" John asked, his voice trembling with fear and confusion. Sarah turned, her face streaked with tears, eyes wide with terror. "John," she whispered, "we have to leave, now." But it was too late. The door slammed shut, sealing their fate. The house had claimed them as its own, its dark history repeating itself once more. Our second story takes us to a house that stood defiant amidst a sea of concrete and steel. It was an anomaly, a relic of the past that refused to be overshadowed by the modern world. The Vanishing House, they called it, a name whispered with a mix of fear and curiosity, a place where reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. It was as if the house existed in a liminal space between the known and the unknown. It was a stately Victorian home, its facade dulled with time and neglect. The paint was peeling and the windows were clouded with dust, yet it retained a certain grandeur. It stood on a street in a perpetual state of twilight, shrouded in an unnatural stillness. The air around it seemed heavier, as if time itself slowed down in its presence. The first to disappear was a family of four, the Millers. They were a picture of happiness, full of hope and excitement for their new home. They moved in with laughter and dreams. The children played in the yard, and the parents planned their future. Then one day, they were gone, vanished without a trace. Their belongings were left behind as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The police investigated, but the house offered no clues, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was as if the family had been erased from existence. It stood silent, its windows like vacant eyes, watching, waiting. Over the years, other families met the same fate, each one drawn to the house by its mysterious allure, only to disappear without a trace. Each time, the pattern remained the same, a period of normalcy, then strange occurrences followed by an abrupt disappearance. It was as if the house was playing a cruel game. The latest victims were the Andersons, a seemingly ordinary family with no idea of the house's dark history. Mark, a history professor, saw it as an opportunity to study the unexplained. He was fascinated by the house's reputation and wanted to uncover its secrets. His wife, Claire, an aspiring writer, saw it as a source of inspiration. She believed the house would provide the perfect backdrop for her next novel. They dismissed the stories as local folklore, tales spun by imaginative minds, but the house had a way of making believers out of skeptics. It started subtly, a misplaced item here, a strange noise there. Doors left unlocked would be found bolted shut. Windows refused to open. Then the whispers began. Soft, almost imperceptible at first. Faint at first, they seemed to emanate from the walls. The whispers grew more persistent, more insistent. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, evolving into guttural growls. The house was alive. It was as if it had a will of its own. One night, as a storm raged outside, Mark awoke to a scream, a blood-curdling scream that pierced the silence of the night. He rushed to Claire's side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Claire! Claire! What is it?" he called out, his voice trembling with fear. Claire sat upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking, her face pale. "Mark, the house, it's trying to take me somewhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark tried to calm her, but a seed of doubt had been sown. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Mark awoke to an empty bed. Claire was gone. He searched the house, his calls for Claire echoing through the empty halls. Panic set in as he realized she was nowhere to be found. He raced outside and looked up at the house, desperation in his eyes. The house seemed to shimmer, its outline blurring as if it were fading from existence. It was as if the house itself was vanishing, taking Claire with it. Chapter 3. The Dreadful Manor. Our final destination takes us far from the city's clamor into the heart of the desolate moors. This story unfolds in the desolate expanse of the moors. There stood Blackwood Manor, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. The manor was imposing, a Gothic monolith of dark stone and even darker history. Its walls seemed to whisper secrets of the past. Gargoyles leered from its heights, their shadows stretching like claws, as if to warn intruders of the dangers within. It had been empty for decades, its previous occupants driven mad or worse, leaving behind only echoes of their torment. Enter Edward and Eleanor Vance, a couple on the run from their past, seeking solace in the manor's isolation. Edward, a reclusive painter, was captivated by the manor's morbid beauty, seeing in it a perfect subject for his art. Eleanor, a writer, saw it as a muse, a place where she could finally pen her magnum opus. They arrived on a day choked with fog, the manor looming out of the mist like a specter from a nightmare. As they stepped inside, a palpable chill settled over them, as if the house itself was exhaling a cold breath. The first few days were uneventful, the silence broken only by the howling wind and the creaking of the old house. Yet a sense of unease clung to them. It began with whispers, faint and almost imperceptible. Soft at first, they seemed to emanate from the walls, growing louder with each passing night. The whispers grew louder, morphing into anguished cries that echoed through the halls. Then came the apparitions. Fleeting glimpses at first, shadows that danced at the edge of their vision, always just out of reach. But soon, the apparitions grew bolder, more visible and increasingly menacing. Eleanor, always the more sensitive, was the first to succumb to the house's malevolent influence. She became withdrawn, her nights plagued by vivid nightmares that left her trembling and exhausted. Edward, initially dismissive of her fears, found himself unable to ignore the growing dread that permeated the air. He watched helplessly as his wife slipped further into the clutches of the darkness that seemed to envelop the manor. One evening, Edward found Eleanor packing a bag, her hands trembling with urgency. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Edward asked, his voice tinged with concern. Eleanor whirled around, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "We have to leave, Edward. This house, it's alive. It's trying to keep us here forever." Her words, though frantic, struck a chord deep within Edward, resonating with his own unspoken fears. Edward tried to reason with her, but the conviction in her eyes made him hesitate. They rushed out of the house, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and desperation. As they reached their car, the headlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. A guttural growl echoed through the air, sending shivers down their spines. Edward turned and saw them, the apparitions, no longer fleeting shadows, but solid, menacing figures. The apparitions, no longer fleeting shadows, but solid, menacing figures, advanced towards them with malevolent intent. They were never seen again, swallowed by the darkness of the dreadful manor and the moors that surrounded it. The houses stand, silent sentinels to the darkness within their walls. Thank you for joining me on this chilling exploration of the unknown. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't see.